I woke before the light, the kind of gray that makes the world hold its breath. The house had the faint, clinging smell of lilies, sweet and heavy, like a kindness that overstayed its welcome. I ironed a black dress with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and found in the pocket of my coat a receipt with his handwriting on it. It said, "Milk, batteries, call mom." Ordinary, domestic, unbearably alive. I folded it once, twice, and slid it beneath my palm like a pulse I could press to keep time from moving. By the time I reached the church, the steps were damp, and the wind worried the ribbons tied to the floral stands. Someone touched my elbow. "I'm so sorry," a woman whispered, big eyes wet and kind, already looking past me to the doors. He was a good man. I nodded, because the alternative was to scream. Inside, the sanctuary pooled with murmurs and perfume and the rustle of programs. His photograph, his laugh caught midair, watched me from the easel. It's a cruel trick, how photographs are louder than silence. The front row waited for me, a space kept open like a mouth, and I took it as if the wood might splinter under my weight. "Are you ready?" the pastor asked, stooping to catch my gaze. "I don't know what that means," I said. My voice sounded like a stranger in my throat. He patted my shoulder. "We'll take it one breath at a time." People filed in. Shoes clicked. Someone sobbed in hiccups. I folded the program so many times it became a sharp little square in my fist. There were names he used to say in bed, in the soft dark. Neighbors, co-workers, the UPS guy who always forgot the gate code. And I waited for those names to become faces, for faces to become condolences. "Look at her," a voice hissed somewhere behind. "So young." Another voice, "He was lucky." I wanted to turn around and ask them what they knew, what they didn't, whether grief made me look younger or older or merely hollowed out. Like a house after a fire. The shape still there, the rooms all smoke, the organs swelled, the doors at the back groaned open, air shifted, an invisible hand moving through the pews, and heads turned in one motion, as if cued by a conductor. I felt it before I saw it, a tremor running under the floorboards of my life. I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and fixed my eyes on the aisle, prepared to greet whoever came to say goodbye to my husband. I didn't know then that they weren't coming to me at all. The sanctuary was already filling when I walked in, the air thick with perfume, damp coats, and the faint burn of candle wax. My heels tapped against the marble floor, each sound too sharp, too exposed, as if announcing that I was the only person in the room who didn't know her lines. I slid into the seat reserved for me at the very front, his wife's seat, and forced my hands to lie still in my lap. The pew was polished smooth from years of sorrow pressing down on it. But that day it felt like glass beneath me, cold and fragile. I tried to steady myself by looking at his photo again. That familiar grin caught mid-laughter, as if mocking the idea that he could ever be gone. Then it happened. The back doors creaked, and a ripple passed through the room. I turned my head instinctively, like everyone else, and that was when I saw them. 3 figures moving down the center aisle with a calmness that chilled me. A woman in black, veil drawn low, steps measured, not hesitant but claimed, as if she knew exactly where she belonged. On either side of her, 2 teenagers, 1 boy, 1 girl. The boy's shoulders were broad, already carrying the weight of something bigger than himself. The girl clutched a small clutch bag against her chest, her knuckles white, her eyes darting toward the coffin, as if she was trying not to cry. But what froze me wasn't their composure. It was their faces. The boy's jawline, his jawline, strong, square, defiant. The same one I'd cupped in my palms 100 times. The girl's eyes, dark, restless, identical to the ones that used to glance at me across crowded rooms with a secret smile. My stomach turned, a silent rebellion inside me. I gripped the edge of the pew until the wood dug crescents into my skin. No, just a resemblance. Coincidence. That's all. Yet the way the woman guided them forward, a hand lightly brushing the boy's shoulder, the way the girl leaned into her with the kind of trust children only give to blood, it whispered a truth my mind wasn't ready to hold. They didn't hesitate when they reached the front row. They didn't glance around for guidance. They sat, bold as a flag planted on foreign soil, directly across from me, almost daring me to question their right to be there. Someone behind me whispered, "Who are they?" Another answered, "Must be family." Family. The word landed heavy, echoing in the hollow places inside me. I felt the room tilt, as though the ground itself had chosen sides, and for the first time that day, I wasn't sure if I was sitting in my rightful place, or if I had just been pushed aside in my own story. It began like the soft rustle of leaves. Small voices carried on the air. At first I thought it was just the normal hum of grief. The sighs, the shifting feet, the quiet weeping that belongs to any funeral. But the whispers sharpened, pressing against my skin until I couldn't ignore them. "Do you know them?" Someone breathed behind me. "I thought you did." They came in like they owned the place. Maybe they're from work? I didn't turn around. My body stayed frozen, but every syllable pierced straight through me. My fingers worked nervously at the folded program in my lap until it was nothing but a crumpled knot. From the corner of my eye, I stole another glance at the front row. The woman in black didn't shift under the attention. She sat perfectly upright, veil tilted just so, like someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. Her children, were they hers? Were they his? Sat with their backs straight, their silence disciplined. They didn't fidget, didn't look around nervously the way guests do when they don't know their place. No, they were at home there. Strange, isn't it? The way they walked in. Another murmur rose, cutting through the hymn's opening notes. Not like visitors, more like... The voice trailed off, but I felt the unfinished word hanging in the air. Family. The sound of it, even unspoken, slammed into me. I fought to keep my breathing even. Don't look. Don't ask. Don't give them power. Yet my eyes betrayed me, sliding back to their profiles, tracing the curve of the boy's nose, the tilt of the girl's chin. Every feature was a reminder. Every detail was a possibility. Poor thing, I heard Mrs. Nash whisper somewhere close, her voice carrying pity like a poison. She doesn't know. The room seemed to shrink. The organist faltered, missing a note. Even the pastor's gaze flickered, resting for a moment too long on the woman in black before snapping back to his Bible. It was as if everyone else could see the storm forming, and I was the only one still pretending the sky was clear. I swallowed hard, the taste of iron on my tongue. My mind screamed for answers, but my body knew better. It stayed silent, rigid, guarding the fragile shell of denial I was clinging to. And yet, in that silence, the whispers grew louder, circling me like vultures. The truth was already in the room, perched in the front row, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it opened its mouth and called me by the name I feared most, the stranger. The pastor's voice rose steady and practiced. speaking words of comfort that felt like they were aimed at someone else. I tried to let them wash over me, to anchor myself in the rhythm of the scripture, but my eyes kept betraying me, sliding toward the other side of the front row. The woman in black hadn't bowed her head. While everyone else folded into grief, she sat tall, her spine a line of defiance. Her hand rested on the boy's shoulder, protective but also possessive, like a seal pressed onto wax. The girl leaned slightly against her, and together they formed a portrait I didn't recognize, but one I couldn't look away from. The sanctuary blurred around me. The faces of friends, neighbors, co-workers, all the people who had known us, who had known me as his wife, suddenly seemed distant, like extras in a film. The spotlight had shifted, and I, who had lived the last 9 years at his side, felt myself fading to the edges. I wanted to shout, "This is my story. He was my husband. I was the one who stayed up with him when he had nightmares. I was the one who pressed cold cloths to his forehead when fever broke him. I was the one who heard his laugh echo off our kitchen walls. But instead I sat in silence, my lips pressed together so tightly they ached. Because deep down, a darker voice whispered back, maybe you weren't the only one. Maybe you were never the whole story." The pastor called my husband's name, drawing out the syllables like a blessing. I closed my eyes, but the sound twisted inside me. It no longer belonged entirely to me. It belonged to them too. Those strangers who looked at the coffin with the same aching recognition I carried in my chest. I had always believed grief was solitary, a private well of sorrow. But now I saw it stretched across 2 families, parallel lines colliding in this one cruel moment. And in that collision, I felt myself being rewritten, not as a wife, not even as a widow, but as something lesser. As if I had wandered into a story that had started long before me. As if I were the guest at my own husband's funeral. As if I were the stranger. Grief has a cruel way of unlocking doors you thought were sealed. As the service droned on, my mind slipped back. Not to the day we married, not to any holiday or milestone, but to the very first time our eyes met. It was late summer, the kind of evening when the air clings to your skin and cicadas sing like they're trying to outlast the heat. There was a street fair downtown, lanterns strung overhead like lazy constellations. I wasn't supposed to be there. A friend had begged me at the last minute, dragging me through rows of food stalls and carnival games. I remember turning, irritated, about to complain about the crowd, and then seeing him. He stood in front of a bakery booth, holding a small plate with the last lemon tart. When he noticed me eyeing it, he tilted his head, smiled that mischievous smile I would come to know so well, and said, "Do you want it?" I should have walked away, but something in the way he asked made it impossible. "Split it?" I suggested. His laugh burst out, bright, unguarded. "Only if you take the bigger half." We ate it standing side by side, the tart too sweet, the crust crumbling between our fingers. He licked sugar off his thumb and grinned. "I'm Daniel," he said, "but most people just call me Dan." "Most people," I teased. "How many names do you have?" "Enough," he answered, eyes glinting with something I thought was charm. Looking back now, I wonder if that moment was the first shadow of all the secrets he carried. But at the time, it only felt like magic. The noise of the fair faded, and all I could hear was the steady rhythm of his voice, low and warm, as though he was already letting me into some private orbit. Later that night, When he walked me to my car, he said, "I don't believe in accidents. I think we meet people for a reason." I remember laughing nervously, pretending to disagree, though my chest was already tight with something dangerous: hope. I told myself then that the universe had written us into the same story. I never imagined it had written me into only one chapter. They say love should take its time, that you should let it simmer, test it against the seasons, watch how it weathers the storms. We didn't. We leapt. Within weeks of that first meeting, Dan was everywhere. He called me on his lunch breaks just to hear my voice. He showed up outside my office with takeout containers, grinning sheepishly as if romance could be tucked inside paper bags. On Saturdays, we wandered flea markets, inventing stories about the people who had owned the chipped teacups and faded photographs. By Sunday evenings, he was already settled into my apartment, his shoes lined neatly by the door, his toothbrush waiting next to mine. It felt intoxicating, the speed of it all. I told myself it was fate, not recklessness. "When you know," he'd whisper as he traced lazy circles on my palm. And I wanted so desperately to know. Friends raised their eyebrows. "Isn't it fast?" one asked. "Don't you want to take your time?" But time had never felt like a luxury with him. It felt like something fragile, fleeting, something I needed to catch before it disappeared. He had this way of looking at me, steady and unblinking, like he was memorizing every detail for safekeeping. "You're my anchor," he said once, when we were lying on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The reason I stopped running. I didn't ask what he had been running from. I didn't want to break the spell. Instead, I poured myself into the life we were building, into the laughter echoing in small kitchens, into the road trips where he sang off key until I begged him to stop, into the whispered confessions at 2 a.m. when the world felt narrowed down to just us. Looking back now, I can see how the speed was its own kind of camouflage. The faster we moved, the less time I had to question. The less time I had to notice the gaps in his stories, the way he sometimes changed the subject too quickly, the moments when his eyes flickered with a history I didn't recognize. But back then, I didn't care. I mistook momentum for certainty. I mistook passion for permanence. I mistook a sprint for forever. Our wedding was small, almost modest, but to me, it felt like the center of the universe. A late October afternoon when the leaves were crisp and red and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. We chose a clearing beneath a great maple tree, its branches scattering sunlight in coins across the grass. I remember my hands trembling as I clutched the bouquet, my stomach tight with nerves and wonder. Then I saw him, waiting at the end of the aisle, his tie slightly crooked, his smile wide enough to steady me. The music swelled, and suddenly the world blurred until only he remained in focus. He fumbled with the ring. Of course he did. Everyone laughed and he blushed, grinning that boyish grin that had undone me from the very beginning. When he finally slipped the band onto my finger, his voice broke as he whispered his vow. "I will keep your truths. I will keep your heart safe." When it was my turn, I looked into his eyes, those deep, unreadable eyes that I thought I knew better than anyone, and I promised, "And I will keep yours." The reception was a jumble of laughter and clinking glasses. The cake was spiced with orange and clove, the kind of flavor that lingers on the tongue long after it's gone. We danced badly, offbeat, stumbling into each other with clumsy joy. At one point, he leaned down, pressing his forehead to mine, and whispered, "This is forever." That night, When the guests had gone and the quiet of our hotel room wrapped around us, he curled against me, his hand resting over my heart. "I like falling asleep like this," he murmured. "It steadies me." I believed him. I believed in us. I thought vows were foundations, permanent and unshakable, like houses we would live in for the rest of our lives. I didn't yet understand they could also be like rented rooms, warm for a time, but never truly ours to keep. Marriage, in the beginning, was not fireworks or grand gestures. It was smaller things, the quiet rituals that stitched our days together until they felt seamless. Saturday mornings meant farmers' markets, wandering hand in hand between stalls, arguing over which peaches were ripest. Sundays meant laundry, clotheslines sagging with the weight of our ordinary lives. Weeknights meant dinners at the rickety old table he'd inherited from a friend, the wood-scarred and uneven, but sturdy enough to hold our laughter. He changed the light bulbs without me asking. I scheduled the dentist appointments for us both. When the faucet leaked, he crouched under the sink with his toolkit, muttering curses that made me laugh until my sides hurt. When my father fell ill, Dan drove overnight to bring me a pot of soup. It had spilled in the car, soaking the mats, leaving a permanent stain. But when I apologized, he only grinned and said, "Worth it." There were evenings we sat on the couch, the television flickering, his head resting on my shoulder. He would trace absent-minded patterns along my arm, and I thought, this is what home feels like. We were building something, brick by invisible brick. I believed every gesture was a promise, every shared chore another thread tying us closer. He had a way of making even the smallest moments feel deliberate, intentional, as though he was crafting a life that belonged only to us. And I clung to that belief. Let it fill the spaces where doubts might have settled. Looking back now, I wonder if he was practicing balance, carefully giving just enough, carefully showing just enough, so that I never leaned too close to the cracks. At the time, though, I never questioned. I told myself love was not in the grand declarations, but in the simple acts. Folded laundry, a replaced light bulb, a bowl of soup on a long drive. And maybe it was. Maybe it always is. But sometimes I think those simple acts were also his camouflage. It wasn't the big milestones that defined us. It was the little victories, the silly triumphs, the private jokes no one else could understand. Like the night we stayed up until 2 a.m, finishing a 1,000-piece puzzle of a lighthouse. My eyes were burning, my back ached. But when we fit the final piece, Dan threw his arms around me and shouted like we'd just won a championship. We left it on the table for weeks, too proud to take it apart, or the way we gave names to the neighborhood strays. There was a ginger cat we called Captain, because he always seemed to lead the others. A scrappy black one became Shadow. Every time one of them wandered into our yard, Dan would narrate their adventures like a children's story, making me laugh until my stomach hurt. Even the spider in the bathroom, most people would have killed it without a thought. But he pointed at its web one morning and said, "She's clearly hardworking. Let's call her Harriet." For months, Harriet stayed, and every time I saw her, I thought of the way he looked at small things, as though they mattered. There were afternoons when sunlight poured through the window and landed just so on my shoulder, and he would pull a blanket over my feet, saying, "Stay warm." Moments so ordinary they shouldn't have meant anything, yet I hoarded them like treasure. One evening, we were crossing the street when we saw an old couple, hand in hand, shuffling slowly to the curb. Dan stopped mid-step, his throat tightening. "I want that," he said softly. "I want to be old with you." I remember leaning into him, pressing my forehead to his cheek, believing every word, believing we had decades ahead, that we would wrinkle together, gray together, fade together. Back then, happiness felt like a solid thing, unshakable. I mistook its sweetness for permanence. I thought love, once found, was indestructible. But the truth, what I would only learn later, is that even the happiest memories can curdle, can turn on you, can become weapons when grief sharpens them. For now, though, they were simply ours, and I held on to them, not knowing they were already borrowed. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruel trick. I didn't wake up one day and find him gone. It was slower, like a draft seeping under the door, easy to ignore until suddenly the whole room feels cold. At first it was just the silences, small gaps in our conversations where words used to tumble easily. He'd sit at the table, staring at his phone a moment too long before catching himself, sliding it face down with a forced smile. "Work again?" I asked once, trying to sound casual. "Quarter-end chaos," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. He always used that phrase, as if financial deadlines could explain why his eyes looked somewhere I couldn't follow. Then came the late responses. A text at noon, answered at 5. Calls sent straight to voicemail. When I asked, he'd shrug, kiss my forehead, and say, "You worry too much." And I wanted to believe him. I did. Nights stretched longer. He claimed conference calls that ran past midnight, his voice low behind the closed office door. I'd press my ear to the wood sometimes, hearing only muffled tones, my chest tightening with questions I didn't dare ask. He began sleeping with his phone under his pillow. "It's just my alarm," he joked when I teased him. But the joke never landed. He didn't even smile. At dinner, I'd talk about my day, about the neighbor's dog that kept digging up our tulips, and he'd nod in all the right places. But his gaze was elsewhere, as if he were listening to someone speaking at a frequency only he could hear. I told myself it was stress, that everyone goes through rough seasons, that love meant patience. And when he came back to me, when he reached across the bed and pulled me close, when he whispered, "I love you," into my hair, I clung to those moments like proof, like lifelines. But deep down, something inside me had already started to ache. A quiet, nagging ache that whispered of cracks beneath the surface. I ignored it, because I wanted him more than I wanted the truth. The night he didn't come home until nearly 2 a.m, I sat on the couch with the lamp still on, pretending to read a book I hadn't turned a page of in hours. Each car that passed outside made my heart jolt, only to sink again into that hollow pit of waiting. When his key finally turned in the lock, relief and anger collided so hard inside me that I could hardly breathe. "You're late," I said, voice trembling, though I tried to make it sound casual. He kicked off his shoes, ran a hand through his damp hair. He smelled faintly of rain and asphalt. "I'm sorry. There was an emergency at work. Servers crashed. Everyone had to stay." At 1:45 a.m, his lips twitched, a weary smile half-formed. Servers don't sleep. It should have been funny. Once, maybe it would have been. But now it only felt like a wall between us, a line rehearsed too smoothly. I wanted to push harder, to demand the truth. Instead, I let the words choke in my throat, because I was afraid of what the answers might be, afraid of the fracture I already sensed forming between us. So I did what I always did. I reached for him. "Come on," I said softly, standing to boil water for tea, as if ritual could patch the distance. We sat at the kitchen table, the steam curling between us, his eyes heavy-lidded. Before he could even finish half the cup, his head dropped forward onto his arms. Sleep claimed him like a thief, sudden and complete. His mouth fell open, his knuckles relaxed, and for a moment, he looked impossibly young, almost like a boy lost after curfew. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, my fingers trembling. This is him, I told myself. This is the man I know, the man I love, the man who chose me. I let that moment be enough. But somewhere in the silence, as the tea cooled and the clock ticked toward dawn, I wondered if love was supposed to feel this much like waiting for someone who might never fully arrive. The questions started small, like pebbles tossed into still water, ripples I tried to ignore. One afternoon, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket from a restaurant across town, a place we had never been together. "Business lunch," he said quickly when I asked, his eyes flicking away before landing back on mine with forced steadiness. I told myself not to doubt him, not to make something out of nothing. Then there was the drawing, a child's scrawl of stick figures tucked into the glove compartment of his car. A house, a sun, a man with broad shoulders. At the bottom, in uneven letters, it said, "For Daddy." My chest had tightened when I showed it to him. "Who gave you this?" He chuckled, a little too loud. "One of the guys at work. His kid must have slipped it in there as a joke." He kissed my forehead as if that sealed the explanation. But when he turned away, I noticed how carefully he slid the drawing back into the compartment, almost reverently. Another time, I found a card addressed to D in neat handwriting, a birthday card, unsigned, with a note inside. "You make us whole." I had never called him D. I asked, "Who writes to you like that?" He smiled, soft, practiced. "Just an old friend." Then he pressed his lips to my hair and said the words he always used to end the conversation. "We're fine. Don't worry." And because I wanted to believe, because I was terrified of what might happen if I pulled too hard at the thread, I nodded and let it drop. But the questions never left. They circled me at night when he was gone, shadows against the ceiling, whispering. I'd reach for his side of the bed, cold and empty, and wonder what truths lived in the spaces he never offered me. I told myself trust meant silence, that if I loved him, I didn't need every answer. But deep down, I knew. I was mistaking silence for peace. And unanswered questions don't vanish. They grow teeth. They wait. The call came at 4:11 a.m., the kind of hour when the world feels half dead, when even the clocks seem hesitant to tick. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and for a moment I thought it was him, finally explaining where he was, finally giving me an answer. But it wasn't his voice. It was a stranger's, clipped and careful. "Ma'am, there's been an accident." The words hit like ice water, shocking, impossible. I sat up, the sheets tangled around me, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the details. Wet roads, a truck that swerved. No time to react. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Gone. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and despair. They led me down a corridor that echoed with every step. When I saw him, he looked almost peaceful, as though he'd only fallen asleep after a long day. His hair was mussed, his lips parted. For a second, just a second, I thought if I shook him hard enough, he'd wake up. I pressed my ear to his chest, hunting desperately for a sound, any sound. But there was only silence. The silence of a world that had let go of him too soon. The nurse touched my shoulder gently, murmured something about paperwork. I signed forms I couldn't see through the blur of my tears. My hand moved across the pages like it belonged to someone else. In my pocket, I found myself clutching a crumpled piece of paper, that old receipt he had scribbled on weeks before. Milk, batteries, call Mom. The ordinariness of it broke me. He was supposed to do those things. He was supposed to come home. The drive back was a blur of headlights and rain streaks. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached, whispering his name over and over, like a prayer, as if repetition could reverse time. By the time I reached our house, dawn had begun to creep across the sky. The world was waking up, oblivious to the fact that mine had ended. And yet, beneath the crushing grief, another thought wormed its way in, unwanted, undeniable. If he had been with me, in our bed where he belonged, he wouldn't have been on that road at all. I wasn't just mourning him. I was mourning the truths I would never know. After the hospital, after the papers I signed without reading, after the drive home that felt like I was floating outside my own body, I sat in the dark of our bedroom, his side of the bed still unmade. My phone lay silent on the nightstand, a black screen reflecting my hollow face. Then it rang. The number was unfamiliar, long digits glowing against the dark. My chest tightened. For a heartbeat, I thought it was a mistake, or maybe someone from the hospital with more questions. I answered with a shaking, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was soft, urgent, almost breaking. A woman. "Is he okay?" she asked, barely a whisper. "He didn't come home." The world spun. My mouth went dry. I'm sorry, who is this?" Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could hear her breathing, rapid, shallow, desperate. Then, with a sharp gasp, she hung up. I stared at the screen, the call log blinking up at me like an accusation. My heart thundered in my ears. Didn't come home. Those words looped in my mind, over and over. They weren't the words of a stranger. They were the words of someone who was waiting for him too. Someone who expected him to walk through their door that night. I sat frozen, phone clutched to my chest. The echo of her voice seared into me. My tears had dried into something else now. Something jagged, corrosive. For the first time, grief wasn't the only thing filling me. Suspicion was there too, sharp as glass. Who was she? Why did she believe he was supposed to come home to her? The darkness in the room thickened, pressing down on me. His shirt still hung in the closet. His cologne still lingered in the air. And yet suddenly, it all felt counterfeit, like a stage set built for my benefit, while another life waited for him somewhere else. I curled onto the bed, pulling the blanket tight, as if it could shield me from a truth I wasn't ready to face. But deep down, I knew. That phone call wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of an unraveling, and it broke something in me that could never be mended. Grief has a way of turning you into an administrator. One moment you're collapsing under the weight of loss. The next you're making phone calls, choosing flowers, arguing with the insurance company, deciding between hymns you barely remember. It's cruel. How bureaucracy demands composure when your heart is in shards. I found myself standing in the funeral home, nodding at catalogs of caskets, pretending to care about wood finishes and satin linings. The director spoke in a hushed, practiced tone, as though rehearsed from countless tragedies before mine. I wanted to scream at him that this wasn't routine, that this was my life, my husband, my everything. but instead I signed the papers, initials scrawled like the hand of someone I no longer recognized. At home, casseroles appeared on the doorstep. Neighbors came with awkward embraces and the same words over and over. He was a good man. You're being so strong. I learned quickly that strong didn't mean resilient. It meant silent, dry-eyed, manageable. They wanted grief to be tidy, something that didn't spill onto their shoes. I spent hours going through our photos, choosing which ones would be displayed. His smile stared back at me from every frame, careless, unknowing. I picked the picture of him laughing, head thrown back, eyes crinkling at the corners. I wanted the world to remember him that way, alive, not this empty body lying under embalmer's hands. When it came to hymns, I chose the ones he hummed badly under his breath while washing dishes. At the time, it had annoyed me, the way he was always off-key, always a beat too slow. Now I clung to the memory like it was gold. One night, long after midnight, I sat at the kitchen table with a list of pallbearers in front of me. My pen hovered over the names of his friends, co-workers, cousins. My vision blurred, the ink smearing. It felt obscene, this assigning of roles, like a stage play for a man who should have still been here to take his own bow. And yet, beneath the motions, beneath the exhaustion, the doubt lingered. That phone call, that woman's voice. He didn't come home. The words wouldn't let me rest. So even as I ironed my black dress, even as I rehearsed the order of the service, a quiet dread grew inside me. I wasn't just preparing for a funeral. I was preparing for a truth I didn't want to meet. The morning of the funeral, I woke with a knot in my stomach so heavy it felt like stone. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. His suit, freshly pressed, lay draped over a chair, waiting for a body that would never wear it again. When I arrived at the church, clusters of mourners stood on the lawn, their voices hushed, their eyes heavy with pity. Most of the faces were familiar. Neighbors, old co-workers, distant cousins. I nodded mechanically, accepting their condolences as though I were underwater, every sound muffled and far away. But then, as I moved toward the entrance, I noticed them. 3 people standing apart from the rest. A woman in black, her veil pulled low, her shoulders drawn tight as if bracing against the wind. Beside her, a boy and a girl, teenagers, awkward in their grief, their clothes too formal for their young bodies. I didn't know them. At least, I told myself I didn't. Yet something about the boy made my chest tighten. His posture, broad shoulders slightly hunched forward, the same way Dan stood when he was nervous. The girl bit her lip as she scanned the crowd, a nervous tick I had seen in the mirror of my own face too many times to count. I tried to shake it off. Coincidences? Resemblances? Funerals draw people from every corner of a life. Friends from school, colleagues you've never heard of. It meant nothing. And yet, as I stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. Conversations faltered, eyes darted between me and them. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft but insistent. "Do you know who they are?" someone whispered. "No, but they look familiar." My heart pounded, uneven, traitorous. I wanted to turn, to demand answers. But my legs carried me forward, into the sanctuary, into the role I was supposed to play. The grieving wife, the widow in black. But deep down, the dread I'd been carrying since that phone call began to solidify. Because sometimes the faces you don't recognize are the ones your heart already knows. She sat in the front row, her back straight, her veil casting a shadow that hid most of her face. Still, I could feel her presence like a cold draft running through the sanctuary. People shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from me to her and back again, as if waiting for some invisible line to be drawn between us. The service began, the pastor speaking words of comfort, of faith, of eternal rest. But I barely heard him. My gaze kept pulling toward her, this stranger who sat as though she belonged as much as I did. When the choir finished a hymn, the pastor invited anyone who wished to share memories to step forward. For a long moment, no one moved. Then she rose. The movement was graceful, deliberate, as though she had been preparing for this very moment. The veil shifted as she stood, and I caught the faint outline of her features. Cheekbones sharp, lips pressed tight, eyes dark and unreadable. She walked to the podium with a confidence that rattled me. Every step seemed to claim the space as hers. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, carrying just enough grief to be believable, but not enough to break. He was everything, she said simply. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. Kind, strong, a man who loved deeply, a man who gave more than he ever took. Her words should have comforted me. Instead, they sliced into me, each one a reminder that she spoke of him like she knew him, not as a colleague or a casual friend, but as someone who had lived inside his world. The congregation murmured softly, some nodding in agreement, others glancing toward me. I sat frozen, my fingernails digging into my palm. When she finished, she didn't look at me. Not once. She returned to her seat, lifted the veil just enough to dab at her eyes with a small handkerchief, then rested her hand on the boy's shoulder as if sealing her claim. It wasn't hostility that radiated from her. It was possession. And in that moment, with everyone watching, I felt something shatter inside me. For the first time, I wondered if I wasn't the only widow in the room. They sat so still, so composed, that at first I thought they were simply being respectful. But the longer I watched, the more I realized their stillness wasn't about politeness. It was about belonging. They weren't guests at this funeral. They were claiming it, as though it were theirs as much as mine. The boy couldn't have been more than 16. His hair fell across his forehead in the exact same way Dan's used to when he let it grow too long. He kept pushing it back, impatient, with the same quick flick of the hand I had seen 1,000 times at our kitchen table. His jawline was strong, familiar. My chest tightened every time I looked at him, because I knew that face. I had kissed its mirror countless times. The girl was younger, maybe 14. Her features softer, but no less haunting. She bit her lip when she grew restless, pressing it until it paled, a habit I knew well. Dan did the same when he was deep in thought. Her eyes darted toward the coffin, wide and glistening, and I recognized the same storm of emotions I had seen in my husband's gaze when he was trying to hide what he felt. Every detail screamed at me, louder than the pastor's sermon, louder than the organ. These children weren't strangers. They were echoes, living, breathing proof of a man I thought I knew. Whispers rippled again through the congregation. They looked just like him. Are they? I didn't know he had kids. Neither did I. The girl leaned closer to the woman in black, and the woman wrapped an arm around her shoulders, protective, maternal, certain. The boy sat rigid, staring straight ahead, his lips pressed tight in a line that looked achingly familiar. I gripped the edge of the pew until my knuckles turned white. A part of me wanted to stand, to demand answers right there in front of everyone. But another part, the deeper, more frightened part, already knew the answers and couldn't bear to hear them spoken aloud. I had spent years looking for reflections of myself in Dan, thinking I saw my smile in his laughter, my hope in his eyes. But here, in front of me, sat the real reflections. 2 lives carved from his features, carrying the pieces of him I would never again hold. And in that moment, my grief cracked open into something else entirely: fear. It happened so suddenly, so mercilessly, that I almost thought I had imagined it. The slideshow was playing on the projector, a gentle stream of photographs I had chosen. Dan at the beach, sunburned and grinning. Dan holding our neighbor's puppy. Dan carving a ridiculous turkey at Thanksgiving. I had spent hours arranging those images, thinking they told the story of our life together. But then, without warning, a different picture appeared. It was still him, still Dan, but not my Dan. He was older by months I couldn't account for, standing on a beach I didn't recognize. The towels were different, the background unfamiliar, and he wasn't alone. In the corner of the frame, blurry but undeniable, were the outlines of the woman in black and the 2 children. My breath caught, my vision tunneling. How did that photo get there? The funeral director must have pulled from a folder I hadn't seen, or maybe Dan himself had kept it somewhere, hidden, and now it was betraying him in front of everyone. Gasps rose around me. People craned their necks, murmurs swelling like a tide. I felt every eye flick to me, waiting for my reaction. But I couldn't move. I turned slowly to the front row. The boy didn't look surprised. The girl didn't fidget. They stared at the image with quiet recognition, as though it was a memory they had lived, not a secret just unveiled. The woman in black reached for the boy's hand, and he let her take it without hesitation, the way you do when a gesture has been repeated 1,000 times before. That was when the truth slammed into me. Not suspicion, not theory, truth. These weren't coincidences, not passing resemblances. They were his family, his other life, and me. I was the one who hadn't known, the one sitting in the so-called widow's seat, while another widow sat across from me, flanked by the children he had given her. The slideshow flicked to the next photo, back to something safe, something from my life with him. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The story I thought I knew had been cracked wide open, and there, for everyone to see, was the life he had lived without me. I pressed my nails into my palm until I felt the sting of skin breaking, as if pain could anchor me, keep me from flying apart. But inside, I was already unraveling. And for the first time, I understood. I wasn't just grieving my husband. I was grieving the illusion of the man I thought I had married. When the final hymn ended, the sanctuary hung in silence. People shifted in their seats, hesitant, as though the air itself was waiting for something to break. I clutched the folded program so tightly, it cut into my skin, wishing I could vanish before the whispers solidified into words. Then she rose, the woman in black. Her veil trembled slightly as she turned, her eyes sweeping the room, steady and unashamed. She stepped forward, her children following like shadows. The murmurs rose, sharper now, restless. A cousin of Dan's, standing near the aisle, asked the question that had been building like a storm. "Who are you?" The woman lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, certain, the kind of certainty that comes from ownership, not explanation. I'm his wife. The words dropped like glass shattering. Gasps rippled across the room. Someone behind me muttered, "Impossible." Another, more quietly, "I knew it." My breath stopped in my chest. My whole body screamed against the claim, but my lips still formed the only defense I had. No. I am his wife. The woman's gaze locked onto mine across the casket. For a moment, we were the only two people in the room. She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She just tilted her head, and with a softness that felt crueler than any shout, she asked, "Then who am I?" The boy's fists clenched. The girl leaned into her mother, her glare sharp and unyielding. Around us, friends, neighbors, co-workers, all the people who had known us, who had known me, stared in frozen disbelief. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. I never saw who it belonged to. Male, middle-aged, certain. "She's the stranger." The word echoed, bouncing off the walls, burrowing into me. Stranger. As if I were an intruder in my own life. As if 9 years of marriage, of breakfasts and arguments and whispered promises, could vanish with a single word. I felt the room tilt, my knees weakening, the casket before me blurring through my tears. My husband, my liar, had split himself so cleanly that now even grief had been divided. And in that moment, surrounded by the judgment of the living and the silence of the dead, I realized I had lost more than my husband. I had lost my place in the story. The word stranger lingered in the air long after it was spoken, heavier than any prayer, sharper than any hymn. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the church itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which world would collapse first, hers or mine. The pastor, caught off guard, shuffled his notes and cleared his throat. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. The organist's hands hovered above the keys, frozen mid-motion. The music choked off before it could soften the moment. Friends who had hugged me minutes earlier now avoided my eyes. Some shifted in their pews, restless, guilty, as though they had been caught in the act of witnessing something too intimate, too brutal. Others leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle, waiting for the next line in this unscripted play. Mrs. Nash, my neighbor, pressed a hand to her mouth. I saw her eyes flick between me and the woman in black, calculating, as though she were trying to solve a puzzle she didn't want the answer to. I wanted to scream, to stand and shout, "I am not the stranger. I am his wife." I cooked his meals. I ironed his shirts. I held his hand through every fever and every fear. But my throat was dry, raw, strangled by disbelief. The woman in black did not look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the coffin, her hand still resting on her son's shoulder. Her composure was terrifying. She didn't need to argue. She didn't need to fight. Her very existence was her proof. The boy stared at the floor, jaw tight, while the girl's eyes darted between us, her lip trembling, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't decide whom to address. Then the silence deepened. Not soft, not reverent, heavy. It pressed against my chest, made it hard to breathe. Every tick of the clock above the doorway was another nail driving into the coffin of the life I thought I had lived. I felt my knees weaken, my grip on the pew loosening. The world was splitting into two versions of the same man, and everyone was waiting for me to choose which one I belonged to. But the truth was already written across their faces. In their eyes, I wasn't the widow anymore. I wasn't even the wife. I was exactly what that voice had named me, a stranger. At first, I tried to hold them back. I bit the inside of my cheek, blinked hard, dug my nails into my palms until crescents of pain bloomed there. But grief is stronger than pride, and the dam I had built inside me cracked wide open. The tears came in waves, hot, unstoppable, relentless. They blurred the coffin, the faces, the very walls of the sanctuary. I pressed my hands against my eyes, but it was useless. The more I fought them, the harder they came, spilling over in great, shuddering sobs. Gasps fluttered through the pews. Some people looked away, uncomfortable with a grief so raw. Others leaned forward, pity flashing across their faces like lightning. No one moved to comfort me. I was untouchable now, set apart by suspicion, by shame. Through the veil of tears, I saw her, the woman in black. She didn't cry. Her eyes glistened, yes, but her tears were disciplined, carefully held in check. She reached for her daughter's hand, her face a mask of dignity, of ownership. The contrast between us burned like salt in an open wound. I was unraveling, and she was steady. The boy looked at me then. For the first time, his eyes met mine, and in them I saw not cruelty, not accusation, but confusion, pain even, as if he too was caught in the storm of a man who had split himself in two. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to tell them I wasn't the stranger they believed me to be. But the words drowned in the sobs that tore out of me, unstoppable, humiliating. The pastor cleared his throat again, shifting awkwardly. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we should take a moment." His voice tried to calm the storm, but the silence that followed only made my cries echo louder. I covered my mouth, ashamed of the sound, but it was no use. My grief had a voice of its own, and it was speaking for me now. And as the sanctuary blurred through my tears, I realized something terrible. I wasn't only crying for him. I was crying for myself, for the life I thought I had, for the woman I thought I was, for the truth that had been stolen from me long before I ever walked into this church. The pastor adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled the notes he no longer needed. He had likely officiated dozens of funerals, maybe hundreds, but this was different. He wasn't just guiding a congregation through grief. He was standing at the fault line of a man's double life. His eyes darted between me and the woman in black. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence pressed heavier than any sermon. I could almost hear his thoughts. Which widow do I address? Whose grief do I honor? Finally, he cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he began, his voice careful, deliberate, "there are conversations best had in private." It was meant as kindness, but it sounded like surrender. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some nodded, relieved to have someone break the tension. Others exchanged glances, their curiosity barely masked. The word private hung in the air like an invitation and an accusation all at once. The pastor gestured toward a side room off the sanctuary, a small space usually reserved for Sunday school or storage. "If you'd allow me," he said, his voice faltering, "perhaps the family could talk." The word family cut deeper than any knife. Whose family? Mine? Hers? His? I sat frozen. The damp program crumpled in my hand. But the woman in black stood smoothly, her children rising with her in perfect unison. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at me. She simply walked forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor with quiet authority. The pastor looked at me then, waiting. His eyes were filled with pity, but also with expectation. And so, legs trembling, I rose. We followed him into the side room, away from the curious stares, away from the whispers. The door closed behind us with a heavy click that seemed to seal the air. The room smelled of old varnish and stale coffee, the kind of space that wasn't meant to hold grief this raw. A narrow table stood between us, its surface scarred by years of use. I sat at one end. She sat at the other. The children flanked her like sentinels. The pastor lingered by the door, wringing his hands. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking, "tell me who you are." For the first time, her eyes met mine, and what I saw there made my breath catch. Not anger, not pity, but something far more dangerous. Certainty. As I sat across from her in that suffocating little room, my mind betrayed me, dragging me backward into memories I had long buried. It was a summer evening, years ago. The phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. When I answered, a woman's voice asked softly, "Is Danny there?" "Danny." I had laughed, glancing at him sprawled on the couch beside me. "Wrong number," I said, before passing the phone to him just in case. He took it, listened for only a second, then chuckled too quickly, hanging up almost before a word could be exchanged. "Who was that?" I asked, still amused. He kissed my cheek and grinned. "Someone looking for a Danny. If I were hiding another life, I'd do it better than that." I laughed with him. We made a joke of it, letting the moment slip away like it was nothing. But even then, I remember the way his eyes had shifted, just slightly, like shutters closing. And now, sitting across from the woman in black, the memory clawed its way back with brutal clarity. How many moments had I dismissed? The dinners he claimed were business meetings. The nights he said he had to work late. The receipts from places we had never been together. Each one a breadcrumb I had brushed aside, too afraid to follow. Across the table, her daughter fiddled with a bracelet. Her son stared at the floor. They weren't strangers to him. They were his. And suddenly, that forgotten phone call felt like the first thread I could have pulled, the first crack in the glass I could have noticed. But I hadn't. I had chosen to trust, to silence the questions, to let love cover the noise. And in doing so, I'd let myself become blind. The memory of that night, his laugh, my laugh, the ease with which we dismissed the truth, pressed down on me like a weight. And I realized something devastating. Sometimes the past doesn't just haunt you. Sometimes it mocks you, reminding you of every chance you had to see the truth. And every time you turned away. The graveside surface was held under a gray sky, the kind that threatened rain but never delivered, leaving the air heavy and restless. A green tent flapped gently in the wind, shielding the polished casket from the elements. Rows of folding chairs lined the grass, but the mourners stood, clustering in uneasy knots, their whispers carrying louder than the prayers. I walked slowly, each step sinking into the damp earth. The coffin gleamed beneath the muted light, cruel in its finality. I tried to steady my breathing, but the closer I came, the more the weight of eyes pressed against my back. Everyone was watching, waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. Then she arrived. The woman in black, her children at her side, their shoes darkened by the wet ground. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She walked right up to the graveside as though she belonged there, as though she had as much right as I did, perhaps more. For a moment, we stood only feet apart, the coffin between us like a wall neither of us could climb. The boy's jaw clenched. The girl gripped her mother's hand, her eyes red and glistening. I couldn't hold it in any longer. How long? The words slipped out, harsh and trembling. Her head lifted, her veil shifting enough for me to see the tight line of her mouth. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, steady, unflinching, as if deciding whether I deserved the truth. 7 years, she said finally. The ground tilted beneath me. My knees nearly buckled. 7 years, almost the entire span of our marriage. I swallowed hard. My voice cracked. 9. I had him for 9. Her children shifted, their eyes darting between us, confusion and pain etched into their faces. The boy opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though the question he wanted to ask was too heavy to voice. Finally, in a low, trembling tone, he said, "Did he love you?" The words pierced me deeper than any accusation. I looked at him, at his father's reflection etched so clearly in his features. My throat burned. "Yes," I whispered. "He loved me." The boy's jaw worked, his eyes fierce. He loved us too. The truth settled between us like dirt waiting to be shoveled into the grave. 2 women, 2 families. 1 man who had promised forever to both. And now, only silence remained. We stood in a fragile circle by the open grave, the smell of damp earth rising around us. The pastor lingered nearby, pretending to arrange his notes, but his eyes kept darting toward us, wary, as if afraid the tension might erupt into something he couldn't bless away. Finally, the woman in black spoke. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted the fabric of her skirt, betraying the storm beneath. "We met at a volunteer build," she said, her gaze fixed not on me, but on the casket. Habitat for Humanity. He stayed late after everyone else left, stacking lumber, cracking jokes, making the work lighter. That's who he was. That's how it started. Her daughter leaned into her side, and she wrapped an arm around the girl without breaking stride. He told me he'd lost someone once, that it made him want to live differently. He said he wasn't looking for love, but it found him anyway. He made small things feel big. Birthdays, Sunday dinners, school projects. Her voice caught, but she pressed on. He made us feel whole. I swallowed hard, bile rising in my throat. Those words were mine. They were supposed to belong to my story. She continued softer now. We married at City Hall, quiet, no photos, just a certificate, a ring. He said it was enough. Her son's jaw clenched. He was at every game, the boy said suddenly, his voice sharp, almost defensive. Every single one. He cheered louder than anyone. The girl's eyes welled. He braided my hair when Mom had to work late. Each confession struck me like a blow. I could see their life unfolding. Ordinary, tender, stitched together with the same small rituals I had once thought were mine alone. A second set of keys, a second coffee mug, a second home. I gripped the edge of my coat to keep from shaking. "How?" I whispered. "How did he keep us both?" The woman in black finally turned to look at me. For the first time, there was no defiance in her eyes, only exhaustion. "Because he was good at it," she said. "Too good. He knew how to make you feel like you were the only one." The words sliced clean through me, and standing there at the edge of the grave, I realized the cruelest truth of all. Both of us had been loved. Both of us had been deceived. And now, neither of us could ever have him again. When they finished speaking, the silence pressed harder than their words. I stood there, the wet ground sucking at my shoes, my heart pounding as if it wanted to escape my chest. Everything I thought I knew, every memory, every promise, suddenly felt counterfeit, like a house built on sand. Who was I now? Widow? Wife? Or just a name scribbled on one set of papers, while hers was on another? I felt myself split in two, the woman who had been loved and the woman who had been lied to. Both versions of me were real, and yet neither felt complete. My identity, once so solid, now felt like shattered glass, fragments reflecting different truths depending on where the light hit. I thought of the vows we had exchanged beneath the maple tree. I will keep your truths. Whose truths? Mine? Hers? His? Or none at all? My chest ached with a hollowness I couldn't describe. For years I had anchored myself in him, in us. I was his wife. That was my role, my certainty, my story. But now, even that was gone, stolen by duplicity I never saw coming. The woman in black looked at me across the grave. For the first time, her eyes weren't defiant. They were weary. She knew. She had lost too, even if her loss mirrored mine in a different shape. I don't know who I am anymore, I whispered, though I hadn't meant to speak aloud. The words just tumbled out, raw and trembling. To my surprise, she nodded. Me either. And in that moment, for the briefest second, we weren't rivals. We weren't two women clawing for the same man's shadow. We were simply witnesses to each other's grief, to the devastation of a life that had never belonged solely to either of us. But the fragile connection broke as quickly as it came, replaced once more by the jagged truth. Identity is fragile when it is built on someone else's lies, and mine had just been obliterated. The final prayers faded into the wind, swallowed by the rustle of leaves and the low hum of distant traffic. The mourners began to drift away, their footsteps muffled against the damp grass, their voices hushed with the relief of distance. I lingered. I couldn't move. The coffin sat there beneath the tent, polished and still, waiting for the earth to claim it. My legs felt cemented to the ground, as if leaving meant abandoning him for good. Then the first shovelful of dirt hit the lid. The dull thud reverberated through me like a heartbeat I would never hear again. My chest seized, and tears welled anew. Each sound was another farewell, another reminder that he was being covered, hidden, erased from the world in slow, brutal increments. The woman in black stood opposite me, her children pressed close against her sides. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her presence like a mirror. We were bound in that moment, unwilling partners in a grief neither of us had chosen. When the last handful of earth was thrown, I forced my body to move. My knees shook as I turned away from the grave, the ground soft beneath my heels. Every step felt like betrayal. What if he needs me? What if he comes back and I'm not here? The thoughts were absurd, childish, but grief makes fools of us all. Hands brushed my arm, neighbors, relatives, friends, leaving brief trails of warmth that evaporated as quickly as they came. Their eyes carried sympathy, but also something else now, hesitation, uncertainty, as though they no longer knew how to place me in this story. At the edge of the cemetery, I paused. The wind tugged at my coat, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies and turned soil. I glanced back one last time. The mound of fresh earth stood like a scar on the landscape, raw and final. The woman in black caught my gaze across the distance. For a fleeting moment, her lips parted. I thought she might speak, might offer something. An apology, a truce, a truth. But she only closed her mouth again and turned away, guiding her children toward a waiting car. And just like that, The divide between us stretched wide once more. I walked on, each step heavier than the last, my body moving forward while my heart stayed buried in the ground behind me. In the weeks that followed, I found myself sifting through memories as though they were items in a box I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Every night, I opened it again in my mind, holding each moment up to the light, asking, was this real? Or was it another performance in the double life he choreographed so well? He had brought me tea when I was sick, tucking the blanket around my shoulders with a tenderness that warmed me to my bones. True. He had lied about business trips, claiming late nights in Denver when he was, perhaps, in Detroit. Or worse, at another dinner table entirely. Also true. He had laughed at my mispronunciations, teasing me with that sparkle in his eye, then kissing me mid-laugh. True. He had missed the school recital of a boy whose fingers mirrored his own, because he was with me that night, holding my hand in a crowded theater. True. The ledger refused to balance. Love and betrayal stacked side by side, unmeasurable, inseparable. Some mornings I woke certain that our love had been real, that even his lies couldn't erase the weight of the moments we had shared. Other mornings I was convinced I had been nothing but a shadow, a distraction, a chapter in a book whose ending was written elsewhere. I searched for clues in the most ordinary places. The worn indentation on his side of the mattress, the grocery list still taped to the fridge in his scrawled handwriting, the dent in the couch cushion where he always sat. Were those signs of permanence, or props in a play he had mastered? What remains of love when it is tangled in deceit? It is not clean. It is not pure. It is not the kind of love that poets write about or preachers bless. But it is also not nothing. Because when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the way his hand found mine in the dark, instinctively, like breathing. I could still hear the softness in his voice when he said my name as though it meant home. And maybe that's the cruelest part. The love itself doesn't vanish, even when trust does. It lingers, stubborn and haunting, a reminder that even the truest feelings can be wrapped in lies. Healing didn't arrive like thunder. It came the way dawn does, slow, reluctant, almost invisible, until suddenly the room wasn't dark anymore. I stopped waiting for the dramatic moment when the past would loosen its grip and fall away like a torn sleeve. Instead, I learned the smaller rituals of survival. Making the bed every morning, opening the windows even when the air was cold. Speaking his name out loud so it wouldn't turn to stone in my throat. I returned the overdue library book he'd underlined to pieces. The clerk scanned it without comment, and I walked out blinking at the ordinary cruelty of a world that keeps moving. I replaced the floor mats he'd ruined with soup, and left the old stained ones in the trunk for a week before I could throw them out. I bought a new mug, just one, and chose it because it didn't match anything we owned. I planted a young maple on the balcony, a stubborn twig in a too small pot. Every afternoon, the light coins through its leaves, and I sit with a notebook, listing things that are true. Some days the list is small. The kettle boils. The cat on the fence returns at 4. The neighbor laughs like a trumpet. Other days I'm braver. He lied. He loved me. Both can live in the same sentence without canceling each other out. On an evening edged with rain, I typed a message to the woman in black and deleted it 3 times before I pressed send. The service flowers finally stopped smelling like hospitals, I wrote. She answered hours later. The boy fixed the leaky faucet. He's good with his hands, like his father. We are not friends, exactly. We share weather reports from the same storm. People tell me to forgive him. Some say I should rage. I do both, in private. I forgive the part of him that wanted to be good. I rage at the part that chose to be two men when one would have been enough. I keep both feelings on separate shelves, like jars I open when I need to breathe one way or the other. There are new firsts. The first night I sleep, without waking to listen for a key in the door. The first time I laugh at something stupid and don't feel guilty afterward. The first trip to the farmer's market alone, where I buy peaches and let them bruise in a bowl because no one is there to remind me to eat them. The first time I tell someone when they ask if I'm married, I was, and the words do not crack. Sometimes I imagine his two lives braided into a single rope, and I wonder which thread was mine. But then I look at the maple, at its thin trunk, learning the language of wind, at the way it flexes and does not break, and I decide the rope is not my business anymore. My business is the balcony, the notebook, the kettle, the light. What remains of love is not the certainty I once worshipped. It is attention. It is the tender, ordinary work of staying with myself when the memories gallop, staying with the truth when it buckles, staying with the possible when the past taps on the glass and asks to be let back in. I tell it no, not today. Today I am a woman who waters a tree and waits for roots to take. I am the author of the next page. I am no one's stranger.